Some Pokemon are saved from obscurity with buffs that came at just the right time, allowing them to continue their success. However, not every Pokemon to get buffed is so lucky. Game Freak's gift-giving eye, seemingly more wandering than watchful, can sometimes be generous way too late, and the receiving Pokemon might no longer be able to utilize the buff as it would have at the time that it needed it. We've selected several such Pokemon here, and we're starting off with a triumvirate of after-the-fact terror in the form of Hydreigon. Hydreigon gaining Nasty Plot made it one of the most ferocious threats of early Sword and Shield, an already powerful Pokemon gaining the special Swords Dance that it needed to bring the hammer all the way down against any and all bulky targets set in its way. But as Gen 8's Pokedex expanded, Hydreigon's nasty plotting ways were increasingly sidelined, as was eventually Hydreigon itself, tough as it was to compete in what was increasingly becoming Dragapult and Weavile's metagame. It did see some occasional use, but it would be for the immediate power of choice specs, not wanting to waste a turn on setup. Harkening back to its heyday, faster Pokemon were always Hydreigon's bane, but those earlier metagames were also more bulk-centered in ways that Hydreigon was more apt at punishing. And yet, dangerous as it was, it could struggle to seal the deal. Sure, with good prediction, there wasn't much it couldn't threaten, but this wasn't exactly a recipe for consistency. Despite its excellent move pool, it never had all the moves it wanted. Even in Gen 5, where Draco Meteor destroyed everything, it always wanted something more to really zero in on the destruction of the meta-defining bulky teams. No Pokemon could safely take 2 hits from Hydreigon, but the defensive ones could certainly take one, and that be enough. Had Hydreigon had Nasty Plot back then, it'd have been utterly lights out. No more pivoting around it with specially defensive Gliscor in Gen 5 or the 2 following ones. No more needing to hit Clefable on the Switch with Specs Flash Cannon in Gen 6, as great as it was if this worked. It also wasn't especially pleasant to risk thudding into the Ferrothorn that it was paired with. Hydreigon would be much more difficult to play around if it took its many switching opportunities to Nasty Plot up and be able to dust not just Clefable off, but all its teammates as well. It'd even potentially be able to overrun teams with Chansey that would otherwise stifle standard specs. Even in the faster-paced Gen 7, Hydreigon already has a solid offensive-defensive niche for taking on meta staples in Heatran and Ash Greninja, whose attacks it must roost off. So it would have plenty of opportunity to both fit in and find opportunity to boost. And once it did, the offensive launch would be brutal. Nasty Plot paired with Z-moves. So much for Magearna answering it reliably. It would especially be the bane of balanced teams relying on Toxapex and company, and it would have plenty of ways it could run Nasty Plot too. 3 attacks or 2 attacks and Stealth Rock. Gen 9 adding hazard utility to Hydreigon's game wouldn't be as openly game-breaking in earlier gens, but it sure would be appreciated, and Hydreigon could run it in a number of effective ways. As a dedicated lead-off Stealth Rocker with other utility moves like Taunt and Thunder Wave, or if it wants to go the distance, Roost with 2 attacks like its Gen 7 Defog sets, just with rocks instead of Defog, or yes, alongside Nasty Plot, in the same way a Stealth Rock Garchomp also effectively ran Swords Dance. You could probably even slap Stealth Rock on a Choice Specs or Choice Scarf set, and use that initial switch you forced to set up rocks against a healthy opposing team. Even with Nasty Plot, Specs Hydreigon would of course still have great value, especially with Gen 8's other boost to its move pool, Hydro Pump. Surf's coverage and power is quite solid, as being able to hit Heatran, Gliscor, and Tyranitar all in one move is excellent, but the extra power of Pump would make a world of difference in really threatening them, given the lack of stab, and would be much more difficult to shrug off for neutral targets like Clefable and Tornadus Therian. These moves, great as they are, all became available to Hydreigon after it was no longer able to appreciate and utilize them as well as it once could have. This brings us to another Nasty Plotter whose schemes would have been good if not for being so ill-timed, with Gengar. With its continued dominance and metagame presence in Gens 5 and 6, it really seemed like Gengar would be OU forever. Its speed and power able to match and take on whatever power creep tossed its way. Gengar's fall, though, was not upon losing Levitate in Gen 7. No, it had begun before that. Rather than dropping off between generations, unable to contend with the new wave of threats rolling in, Gengar's time as a major threat actually came within its final 2 generations of OU. In Gen 7, it was the offensive spin blocker, since the previous Gen 4's go-to Rotom A was no longer a ghost type. Gengar's ridiculous frailty meant, as in Gen 4, it couldn't much take hits from the spinners, but it was such a powerful threat alongside hazards that, at worst, could be sacrificed to maintain them against the spinner, allowing its teammates to maintain that element which made them so dangerous. The problem? Teams with Jellicent, a much sturdier spin blocker, made the Gen 5 player base realize that spinning was just not worthwhile. Thus, Gengar was no longer needed to block spin. Even after Excadrill returned to the tier, Jellicent was the tier's go-to, as it was more capable of actually switching into Excadrill. Well, that's fine, because Gengar is free to simply throw around its fast, powerful attacks, right? Yes, but it happens to share its excellent speed stat with the tier's best Pokemon, Latios, who is much more dangerous and can actually switch into opposing Pokemon. There's also Alakazam, which is much faster and actually justifies the terror of clicking the famously unreliable Focus Blast with how much more dangerous it is against everything with its higher power and Magic Guard ability. In comparison, Gengar struggles with both survivability and actually taking out opposing Pokemon. There isn't much place for it. In a similar vein, Gen 6 Gengar was quite a threat for some time, and even in early Gen 7, but it tapered off because, while it hit hard, it just didn't hit hard enough for how frail it was. Like Hydreigon, few opponents could take 2 hits. Except with Gengar, far more Pokemon could take 1, and Gengar also made Hydreigon look like Giratina in terms of taking hits in return. Gengar gained Nasty Plot in Generation 8, but it wasn't enough to bring it back, seeing as it was outdone by the Dragapult running circles around the tier. In a previous generation though, Gengar would be the perfect Nasty Plotter. It would devastate slower teams of course, but it'd be so great because Gengar is already great against the offense teams that it won't have time to plot against. It naturally outspeeds and one-hit KOs many of them. It'd be a nightmare in any matchup. But even bulky teams sometimes run faster checks like Tornado Starion and Scarf Tyranitar, right? Sure, those are indeed Pokemon that would be ruined by one of Gengar's Gen 9 editions, Thunder Wave. The superb 2-move coverage of Shadow Ball and Focus Blast is such that Gengar would have plenty of room to experiment with a 4th move slot, and while Substitute would likely be the standard to turn Chansey into setup fodder, Thunder Wave would be devastating for these faster pivots as well as, well, just about everything. Especially considering Gengar's also got Hex at its disposal. T-Wave doesn't even need Nasty Plot, and for that matter, it doesn't even need Shadow Ball and Focus Blast. Depending on how far you go back with such an addition, Gengar could be using it as far back as Gen 2 and Gen 1, where it levitated just as much as Gen 7. That is to say, it did it. And it not only didn't have any special stab, it also had Earthquake from Snorlax and Tauros to worry about, and it was still a top tier Pokemon. Gen 3 and Gen 4 Gengar with Thunder Wave though, that levitating metagame defining menace would be so frightening as to start a lot of "are we sure this isn't broken" conversations. Toxaspikes was another major Gen 9 edition of Gengars that would have been a major league game changer in its go-to gens. A major problem with T-Spikes is its limited distribution, often being seen on Pokemon that wouldn't see much, if any, use without them. Being able to slap them on a Pokemon that was already so dangerous and could afford such flexibility with its moveset would be a terror. Finally, Encore would be the least directly impactful, but it was another move Gengar gained in Gen 9 that would have found serious use earlier on. Still, it was the trio of Nasty Plot, Thunder Wave, and Toxic Spikes, especially the former two, that would have really let Gengar go berserk in its best days and have those best days through 5, 6, and arguably even 7, rather than petering out in all 3. Now on the subject of Gengar's common competitors and fellow base 110 special attacking threats, we have the Laddies. The Laddie twins were controversial figures as arguably the apex dragons of Gens 4 and 5. The Draco Meteor Age. The experiments of dropping Latias into OU and testing metagames with Latios before unleashing both in Gen 5 led to many a spirited debate about whether they were too much for standard play, is that they were too good not to use. In Gen 4, the OU Latias experiment eventually ended in its ban, though it was then unbanned some 8.5 years later, and despite not seeming broken, wound up having many a call for its reban afterwards. While Gen 5 Latios had many a top player screaming for it to get the axe after another round of its Draco Meteor pulverizing the entire metagame. Some teams even made use of both Latios and Latias to really overwhelm the opponent's limited Lati answers. However, the Fairy generations ushered in by XY saw the Lati twins effectively significantly impeded. They were still highly effective, especially with their new Megas, but Gen 7 saw both Latis drop out of OU proper, and once they were no longer shielded by the Megas in Gen 8, they were completely out to dry. Despite Gen 8 showering them with some of the best moves possible, the most significant of which was Aura Sphere, this alone, if introduced earlier, would have ensured there was no controversy because the Laddies would have been overtly, unquestionably broken to the extent of never being considered for OU in the first place. Their biggest enemy had always been Tyranitar and its pursuit trapping, which was facilitated by massive, sandstorm boosted special defense, so huge as to shrug off even neutral Draco Meteors and super effective Surfs. To be able to blast their best answer with quadruple effective hits that also smacked Heatran and Ferrothorn would have been overwhelming, especially since Aura Sphere was 90 base power in Gens 4 and 5, yet would have still been significant once being nerfed in Gen 6. Considering how often T-Tar was still used to take the Laddies on. The Latis never ran the hidden power fighting for this purpose, since it was so much preferred, and as far as hidden powers went, fire was far preferred. But to that end, the Laddies would have also loved having another Gen 8 buff in its initial 2 fairy generations, Mystical Fire, thus dispensing the need for hidden power fire. Mystical Fire was stronger, clocking in at 65 base power in Gen 6, outdoing the HP Fire which had been nerfed to 60. Then in Gen 7, Mystical Fire was buffed to 75 base power, outdoing even Hidden Power's original 70. This would have made it much easier for Latias to smack the steel types that often got in its way. Aura Sphere for T-Tar, Mystical Fires for Steels, but what of the fairy type enemy it had also gained? Well, for that, it would have loved to have the Future Sight that it would also gain in Gen 8, buffed to its whopping 120 base power in Gen 6. This would have allowed the Laddies to threaten Clefable and friends while setting up their teammates for an unstoppable wall-breaking combination. With these 3 moves, the Mega Laddies might have well been too much, and their base forms would have been something fierce as well, while Aura Sphere alone would have ensured that the first first time they'd touch OU would have been Gen 6. The laddies also gained some nice buffs in Gen 9, but those aren't as game-breaking as these three. Now for a change of pace, we'll stop and smell the roses with Roserade. Roserade was no meta-shattering wall breaker, but it was an incredibly important utility Pokemon in Generation 4, and much of Generation 5 as well, with a unique defensive profile that shrugged off waters, electrics, and status thanks to Natural Cure, while also setting hazards and even potentially dishing out sleep. It was excellent at these jobs, but those who knew it then ached to see the buffs that it's gotten since that heyday, and imagine what could have been. First, the buff to its defense. This doesn't seem particularly significant at first. Rose is no physical wall. When it goes bulky, it's focused on special defense, but it becoming tougher to take on its weaker defensive side is incredibly crucial, especially since with such low stats, each and every boost is significant. For example, even a Pokemon with low special defense like Gliscor can, with EV investment, come to be nigh unbreakable on the special side, whereas after a certain point, putting EVs in its already high defense becomes almost wasted. 80 EVs in special defense make it far tougher to take out overall than the same investment defense. So for Rose in Gens 4 and 5, when it invested in defense, as it did to be able to withstand Scizor's Bullet Punch, 80 to sometimes as much as 120 EVs made a huge difference. Max special defense Rose was also effective, but even as little as 40 defense EVs helped a ton when taking on Pokemon that it commonly faced off against like Breloom, Swampert, and Tyranitar. This buff to its base defense is basically getting 80 EVs for free. This could be sacrificed though if it meant getting the bigger buff, which is the lifting of the restrictions on the best moves in Rose's move pool. Put simply, as soon as Roserade uses spikes in Gen 4, it becomes unable to use Sleep Powder and Leaf Storm. The opposite is also true, and that's a terrible shame. It'd be willing to use a different Grass Stab if it meant getting Sleep Powder. Grass Knot got the job done against most targets, while Energy Ball hit the lightweight Rotom A hard enough to break substitutes. The Sleep plus Spikes was the dream combo, but having a Grass-type Draco Meteor equivalent on a Pokemon with such high special attack would really tie everything together perfectly. As it stands, historically, Roserade sets have been divided. There are the more offensive variants, both in and out of the lead slot, which use fast Sleep Talk to lay Toxic Spikes and then attack with Leaf Storm, and then there are the specially defensive Spike setters, which can run Toxic Spikes as well, but were forced to use alternate Grass Stab. This divide continued into Roserade's use in Gen 5, though there its specially defensive variants were also quite likely to use Sleep Powder and Toxic Spikes. In Gen 6, these restrictions were no more, and Roserade was able to use Spikes, Leaf Storm, and Sleep Powder all on the same set. This was the dream of the preceding two generations, especially as Sleep Powder actually slept grass types back then. Funnily enough, Sleep was eventually banned in both gens, so it wouldn't have been able to utilize the strategy forever. But even afterwards, Gen 4 Roserade in particular still would have loved to be able to lay Spikes down and still threaten with its powerful Leaf Storm. Now before we get into our finale, we've got some honorable mentions, a couple of extremes. On one hand, we've got Flareon, which for some bizarre reason didn't receive Flare Blitz when the move was introduced in Gen 4, and instead had its base 130 attack linger uselessly until finally getting the move in Gen 6, at which point Power Creep ensured it would be useless even with such power at its disposal. But seeing as Flareon was a slow, Stealth Rock weak Pokemon with poor HP and defense to boot, it would have had limited use even in its ideal home Gen 4 NU. Still, it'd at least be something. On the other hand, we've got Groudon, which in Gen 9 received two absolutely staggering additions to its move pool in Spikes and Will-O-Wisp. And yet, thanks to Gen 9 being utterly insane power creep wise, even with these moves, Groudon was merely a pretty good Uber Pokemon, as opposed to the very top tier, ridiculously defining Pokemon it had been before. Imagine any other gen's Groudon with either of these moves, let alone both. It's just lunacy. And that's not even getting into Primal Groudon. It might very well have been another addition to Anything Goes. Now it's time to take things home with our final buff 2 late dragon, Flygon. Flygon was a star in Gen 4 OU, most famous for its Choice Scarf set. A metagame staple for its early game U-turn scouting before its late game dual stabs revenge killing opposing threats wound up sweeping themselves. Despite its lower power relative to the other dragons at the height of Latias Salaman's mania, its role could not be replicated, and thus it had a legitimate place in the so-called 3 Dragon 3 Steel era of the metagame. However, once Latias and Mence were banned, players sought replacements for their Draco Meteor spamming ways. Dragonite was the most immediate replacement for the uncounterable Mixed Mence, and it was excellent, but despite its far lower base 100 special attack, Mixed Flygon eventually took off as well. It was first just used for the surprise factor, mostly for how it excelled at luring in and dispatching Gliscor for the benefit of his teammate Swords Dance Lucario, but eventually the metagame shifted. The surprise factor was no longer there, and Gliscor was less popular, but Mixed Flygon continued to see use even without the support of Lucario, because it turned out to be such a monstrous threat in its own right. With Stab Draco Meteor slamming everything besides Steel types, which were easily taken care of by Earthquake and Fire Blast, Mixed Flygon threatened pretty much everything at least decently, especially since its tremendous resilience to passive damage, immunity to sand and spikes, resistance to Stealth Rock, allowed it to freely use Life Orb without it exacerbating its longevity issues as Dragonite and Infernape might. It came to a point where not not only were you not surprised to see mixed Flygon anymore, but you downright expected it, and it would still threaten you. The player base became increasingly fearful of it, impossible as switching into it had become, and there was genuinely some talk among several high-level players about it being broken and needing to be banned. This wasn't some sort of unanimous idea, as other players thought the very concept of broken mixed Flygon must be some sort of strange shared hysteria, and indeed the thought passed. But it begs the question, what if Flygon had these tools back then that players were glad that it didn't have, but it did eventually gain? By the time it got Swords Dance in Gen 8, it had long since been entrenched firmly as a lower tier Pokemon, and as excellent as Dragon Dance is as a tool, it wasn't enough to change that. Nor was Gen 9 Stealth Rock Edition increasing the utility that it had already employed when it gained Defog in Gen 6. Now imagine a Dragon Dancing, Stealth Rocking Flygon back in Gen 4. Base 100 speed Dragon Dance was a major part of what helped get Salaman's can, since it outsped most of the tier's viable choice Scarfers, or at worst, speed tied with Jirachi, and none other than Flygon. This is why Dragon Dance Dragonite, for all its excellence and power, was much more manageable. What Flygon lacks in base attack, it makes up in packing the perfect speed for such a game-breaking move, as well as stab on its Earthquake being key against targets like bulky variants of Metagross, Jirachi, and Tyranitar, while that incredible typing would make it so much easier to switch in and set up. In addition to resisting Stealth Rock and being immune to sand, making it tougher to pick off with priority, it also would be able to set up against something as commonplace and dependable as Scarf Rotom Ace Thunderbolt. Plus, if it was strong enough to clean up with Scarf late game, it'd be just fine finishing weakened teams off with Dragon Dance, especially since it could so freely run Life Orb. Would it have pushed Flygon over the edge? Well, difficult to say off power alone, but it would also enhance the Mence-like threat of unpredictability. Not knowing whether Flygon was going to Dragon Dance or Draco Meteor would be quite a problem even before addressing the issue of being threatened once you did know what it was doing. Stealth Rock, on the other hand, wouldn't make it broken, but would provide it even more that it could offer a team, as was theorized back in the day when Scarf was pretty much the only set Flygon ran. It did so much with just U-turn and its stabs that it could often run pretty much whatever it wanted in the 4th slot, which would later be demonstrated by how well it used Roost, that you could take advantage of the many free switches it forced to pop up rocks, adding even more to Scarf Gon's immense utility. It could also run different sets, of course. It could be a dedicated Focus Sash lead, it could run the mixed set with Stealth Rock over Roost, similarly to how Garchomp did. It could potentially even run a defensive set. Rocks would have made Flygon even more elite, while Dragon Dance might have pushed it over the edge, or at least had it hang around the threshold of brokenness. You might very well even be able to run both on the same set. After all, Flygon stabs hit almost everything, so you can set up rocks early, then take advantage of its many opportunities to boost at various points, exactly like how Garchomp ran Stealth Rock and Swords Dance on the same set to superb effect. Of course, Gen 4 wasn't the only gen where Flygon would have loved these moves. You could go back even further to its debut in the 3rd generation, where Stealth Rock didn't exist, but Dragon Dance did, and would have made Flygon a late game terror. It's an effective attacker with Earthquake, Rock Slide, and Hidden Power Bug, only held back by coming up just a bit short against Water type, or getting revenge healed by faster Pokemon like Gengar, Aerodactyl, and Jolteon. But with Dragon Dance in the late game, it'd be lights out for all of them. It'd be a premier sweeper. Alternatively, we can go forward to the Gen 5 UU metagame that so resembled the previous gen's OU, in large part because Flygon was similarly elite, and might thus also be a bit difficult to deal with should it suddenly be able to leverage both the power of Choice Band and the speed of Choice Scarf without the one move lock of either that so often gives opponents their counterplay, while potentially even being able to get up rocks early in the game with the same set. Both moves would have also increased Flygon's utility in a metagame with fairy types and made it more threatening to those fairy types that came around in Gen 6 and onwards. It was already top tier RU in Gen 6 and would have loved Dragon Dance with Z moves in Gen 7, but the idea of Flygon legitimately being too much of OU is a tantalizing one that could have only been realized had it gotten these tools in its breakout Generation 4. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Daniel Isbeast, Corman, Don Creek, Eric Dissing, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Nightfall, Megamon VGC, Mojo Gameslayer, Nurse Jake, One Penguin to Rule, Pretzel SP, Schmooter, Seagulls Incorporated, Sojiro Sakura, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soras and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Tyler, Kiboflu, Wardine, Zathor for their major support of our videos.